welcome to another episode of Disasters in History. This week we're going to cover October 13th to October 18th, and today we are starting with a airline disaster. This is the Andes flight disaster in 1972. On October 12th, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 took off from Montevideo, Uruguay, headed towards Santiago, Chile, carrying the Old Christians Club rugby team, several family members, and 5 crew members. In total, 45 people were aboard the plane, and it was fully loaded with luggage and equipment. The original plan was to fly over the Andes Mountains on the 12th to arrive in Santiago, but a storm front was sitting over the Andes, forcing them to land in Mendoza, Argentina, and wait overnight for the storm to pass. Eventually, they took off from Mendoza, heading due south to fly through the Planchon Pass, fly over the Andes, then turn due north to land in Santiago after reaching the Chilean town of Curacao. Because of the cloud cover at the time of the flight, the pilot and co-pilot were flying via instruments only. The pilot was training the co-pilot on how to navigate the Andes Mountains, leaving the co-pilot at the controls. At around 3:20 p.m. or so, the co-pilot notified Chilean air traffic control that they would be reaching Curacao in about 1 minute. The problem was, it took 11 minutes to fly from Planchon Pass to Curacao. It had been at most 3 minutes since they had actually passed Planchon, but no one noticed. The co-pilot then stated he was flying over Curacao and requested to begin descent into Santiago's airport. The problem was, he absolutely was not over Curacao. He received approval to begin descent, but he was not over there, and the airport, the air traffic control did not know it because they were outside of radar range. So they basically told him, yeah, go ahead, despite never actually seeing them in radar. He was in the middle of the Andes Mountains. The plane began to descend, and when they came out of the cloud cover, they realized their mistake. The mountains were directly below them, but even worse, a massive ridge was directly in front of them. The co-pilot attempted to raise the plane to miss the ridge, but there simply was not enough power. The plane struck the ridge and ripped the tail off, causing 5 people to fall out of the rear of the plane and die. It then lost both wings, striking the ground again, one of which caused a hole in the fuselage that pulled out 2 more passengers of the plane, before the fuselage fell down a slope and slammed into a snowbank. One of the passengers died instantly that fell out of the window or the wing hole. The other asphyxiated in a pile of snow trying to find the crash site. When they landed in the pile of snow, the seats were ripped off the bottom of the plane and the cockpit was crushed, killing the pilot instantly and trapping the co-pilot. 4 more passengers died in the collision with the ground. The co-pilot asked the survivors to find his pistol and shoot him because he was pinned in the cockpit with catastrophic injuries and was going to die anyway, but everyone refused, and he ended up dying the day after the crash. 33 people survived the crash, the vast majority of them with major injuries. 5 more would die that same day and the day after. A search and rescue mission was launched almost immediately, and the searching aircraft flew over the crash site multiple times, but were unable to see the bright white fuselage amongst the bright white snow. Survivors attempted several times to make something that would show where they were, but were unsuccessful. The search was called off after 8 days. Now, real quick, we're going to go ahead and look at the actual area where they landed. So, if you look at this particular map right here, this is the area of the Andes Mountains where the crash happened. The mountain range that they crashed in is right here. This is the valley that they landed in right here. And I am zoomed way out right now. They are right here in this general vicinity. Okay? So, think about how far they are away from any civilization. All of this along here is forest. This is the city they were going to right here. They're coming this direction. Well, actually, that's not technically true. They were actually coming up this direction. They were supposed to fly over the mountains down here, and then they would descend into Santiago, which is further up north this direction. However, because if we zoom out even further here, so our area of actual cities, places where people live, is right along here and then right along here. This entire area in between here is basically entirely wilderness. There is almost nothing and almost no one there. It is fully mountains, the entire area. Now, if we zoom in here again, the plane itself actually landed in the bottom of this kind of valley here, this almost box canyon. If we look, so we zoom out here, it hits coming north this direction. It hits the ridge here, bounces over, and then slides down into here. Now, if we make this 3D, they were stuck in this area down in here. They were stuck down in here. It's where the fuselage ended up landing. That's where the 33 survivors were. If you look off in the distance, you can see here is the town that they were headed towards. They are nowhere near where they needed to be at the time of the crash. In fact, if we zoom out again here and we measure from the location of the crash, which is right here, to the city, they were about 90 kilometers from where they were supposed to be. How they ended up 90 kilometers still in the mountains from where they were supposed to be is one of those mysteries. We don't really know, but we'll get into it here in a minute. I just want to give you guys an idea of what we're dealing with and how deep into the actual mountains they were when they crashed, and how, because of where they crashed, they're in the bottom of this valley. So anywhere that they have to go, even if we spin around this direction, they still have to walk a good distance to be able to see anything. If they want to get to the highest, to be able to see how far away from civilization they are, they have to climb up to the top of this ridge here. Even if they climb to the top of this one, it's still blocked. Let me zoom out a little bit. It's still blocked this direction. If you spin around from the top of this mountain, it's blocked this direction. You cannot see anything. And of course, it's going to be worse because at the time it was still the beginning-ish part of spring, because remember, in the southern hemisphere, everything is backwards. So in October, it would have been early spring for the Andes Mountains. So they're still dealing with significant amount of snowpack, significant cold, potential snowstorms, all of that. And they have nothing. It was only supposed to be a 90-minute flight. So they packed, the stuff that was in their suitcases, but no food or anything like that. So after the crash itself, several survivors found a radio jammed between the seats of the actual plane crash itself. They had several seats that didn't get ripped off. They found a radio jammed down in between the seats. They pulled it out and managed to get it working well enough for the survivors to hear that the search had been called off. That's all. And one of the first things that they heard when they got the radio working was that they were no longer going to be searching for them because they believed that the plane was destroyed and there were no survivors. They were on their own. They quickly used available material to turn the fuselage into a shelter to survive the temperatures that dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius overnight. But then came, again, the big problem: food. The plane had 8 chocolate bars, 3 jars of jam, a tin of mussels, a tin of almonds, dates, some random candy, a few dried plums, and several bottles of wine. And because the crash occurred well above the timberline, they had no animals or plants to be able to scrounge food from. All of the above lasted 1 week. After that, they ate foam from the seat cushions and leather from luggage. But that did not last long and also made them incredibly sick. Because of this, they made one of the hardest decisions of the entire crash: to eat the remains of their friends and family members. They laid the strips of flesh out on the ground to dry it out to make it easier to eat. Several survivors only would agree when it was compared to taking Holy Communion, as most of the passengers were deeply Roman Catholic and believed consuming human flesh would lead to eternal damnation. Not long after the last survivor with reservations against eating human flesh finally decided to eat some of the deceased passengers, and 16 days after the crash, so we are a full 2 weeks post-crash where the last person finally decided to actually eat some of the human remains, the shelter was struck by an avalanche overnight that buried the fuselage within 1 meter of the top of the shelter. 8 more survivors died smothered by the avalanche, and the last person who had refused to eat human flesh until they were literally starving was one of those people that died being smothered by the avalanche inside the fuselage. The remaining survivors soon realized they had to make it out of the fuselage or they would run out of air. They dug an emergency tunnel to climb out, only to find themselves trapped by a blizzard. They retreated back into the shelter and stayed for 3 days, eating the bodies of those who died in the avalanche for sustenance. It was after this they realized their only chance was to hike out. Before he died, the co-pilot had kept repeating they had flown over Curacao, which they clearly had not, since the city was in the flat plains and they were in the mountains. But they did think that because of his insistence that they had flown over the city, they were only a few kilometers from any towns along the mountain range. And as we just showed, they were wrong. He was wrong. They were actually just about 60 kilometers away from the closest town and about 90 kilometers from Curacao. The first expedition out planned to go east because of the high mountain to the west. 3 individuals would find the tail section intact with some extra food and some batteries they would use to try and power the plane's radio, but it would not work. The plane radio required 115 volts of AC current. The batteries were only 24 volt DC. The final 3 deaths would occur on November 15th, November 18th, and December 11th. Now remember, the plane crash happened on October 13th. The last death happened on December 11th. That is an incredible amount of time to be living in the mountains, basically surviving off of the flesh of your deceased friends and family. They finally decided to make a trip west to try and make it to Chile, believing they were closer than they were. 3 men sent out to the west, believing they were only about 2,100 meters altitude based on the altimeter in the plane. Unfortunately, it was broken. They were actually at 3,664 meters. What this meant was they had to go significantly farther than any of them had planned for. It would take 10 days to hike essentially 55 kilometers, and then to happen upon 3 men walking along a local river on horseback, who then rode 10 hours into town to notify authorities. Helicopters were provided to rescue the final crew members, and they arrived at the crash site on December 22nd, 1972, 71 days after the initial crash. They were only able to collect half of the survivors, so 4 rescuers stayed behind at the crash site to sleep with the survivors on the mountain. The next day, the remaining 8 survivors were rescued. The remains of those who died in the crash were buried in a common grave at the site, protected by avalanches except for one passenger whose dad arranged to have the body returned home for his beautiful burial. In total, 29 of the 45 people aboard the plane died in the crash. Now, it's an interesting story about that one passenger whose dad had arranged to have his body returned. They put all of the bodies in body bags and then buried them on the mountain, but the dad arranged with the priest ahead of time to provide a special marking on his son's body bag, and then attempted to have his body back and was essentially refused. So he paid a guide to hike him up there on the mountain, dug up his son himself, and then brought it back. On the way back, he was arrested and charged with grave robbing and a whole bunch of other things, but they eventually kind of were like, why are we doing this? This is pointless. He lost his son. He just wants to bury him at home. So they let him go. They let him take him home and bury his son back in his hometown. In addition, when they went back up and buried all of the people that died in the crash, they set the actual fuselage on fire because they weren't going to be able to get it out. And because of the amount of snow that was there, it didn't burn all of it. So when one of the survivors of the crash went back to the site in the 90s, the fuselage was still there. As of right now, most of it, if not all of it, is gone. There may be a couple plane parts still up there in the mountains, but for the most part, most of the remains of the wreckage is gone. In addition, in the aftermath of this particular disaster, it was brought up. It was very quickly revealed what they had to do to be able to survive. There's a photograph, a very famous photograph of some of the passengers sitting there with a human spine that has very clearly been picked clean of meat sitting right next to them. And people that did the rescuing very quickly realized early on that they had eaten the dead passengers to live, and they kind of didn't really say anything about it at first. And then it eventually came out, and then the passengers had originally planned, the survivors had originally planned to announce what they had to do once they'd gotten back and been able to, tell their story. But the news got a hold of it faster than anyone else, so they had to come out much earlier. basically all of the family members of those that died were like, yeah, you did what you had to do to survive, and essentially no one held it against them. And for the most part, most of the passengers that survived ended up having long and relatively successful lives. In addition, because no one really knows exactly what was happening on board the plane or with the co-pilot at the time of the disaster, there's no really good explanation as to why he thought he was further over the Andes than he actually was. No one's ever been able. There's been numerous theories as to why they ended up where they did, but no one really knows exactly why the co-pilot thought that they had flown over a very brightly lit city, and when in actuality they were over the mountains, even in cloudy conditions, because if they were flying by instruments, they still were well far away from where they were, where he requested to begin his descent. And no one really quite knows why. Nobody knows if maybe he saw some kind of light glint off of the snow and thought it was the city, or what he thought he saw, or what he saw on the instruments as to why they began descending where they did. But it's one of those fascinating mysteries of kind of history of why exactly did this happen the way it did, because as best everyone can tell, the plane was operating normally. They never recorded a mayday, anything like that. It was basically, yep, we flew over the city, it's time to begin descent, and then all of a sudden they're crashing into a mountain. So it's really fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating disasters in history. Our next disaster this week is also a bit of a mystery. It's the sinking of the SS Mohegan. On October 14th, 1898, the SS Mohegan set off from Dover, England, bound for New York City, New York, carrying approximately 150 people and 700 cattle. They were traveling down the English Channel at approximately 13 knots. But the problem was they were on the wrong heading and were moving directly at a group of rocks known as the Manacles. They were known as the Manacles because they regularly wrecked ships. The Coast Guard in the area attempted to notify the crew of the Mohegan of the danger by shooting off rockets, but they did not appear to notice. One person on shore noticed they were headed towards the rocks and gathered the crew together to launch a lifeboat to head to where the ship may hit the rocks. And hit the rocks they did. It tore a hole through the bottom of the hull, causing the ship to list to port, then suddenly rock hard to starboard and sink in 12 minutes. At the time of the sinking, most people were in the area, the dining room, getting ready for food, and didn't really realize what had happened until the ship started to tip to one direction and then suddenly tipped to the other. In total, 106 people drowned aboard the ship, including the entire crew. It has never been determined why the ship traveled so quickly at such a well-known hazard. It wasn't like this was a really low tide or something of that nature. They didn't know. They made this trip regularly. The captain made this trip regularly, and they knew the rocks were there, and yet they continued on the exact heading, traveling directly at the rocks at full speed. It is a complete mystery, and it is one that will never be solved because everyone that would have had any idea of, why, died aboard the ship. You can see the remains of the ship here in the background back here, sticking up over the rocks. It's one of those why kind of things of why did they do that? Why? Just simply why. Our next disaster is the Westgate Bridge collapse. On October 15th, 1970, the Westgate Bridge in Melbourne, Australia was under construction. At about 11:50 a.m., a 112-meter span collapsed suddenly and fell 50 meters to the ground below, where a number of construction workers were relaxing on their lunch break underneath the structure. Numerous construction workers were also on top of and inside the span working when it collapsed. In total, 35 construction workers were killed and 18 were injured. The collapse was caused by the removal of about 80 tons of concrete blocks. When the span was placed, it was realized that on the west end of the span, two half girders were slightly off, with one having a higher camber than the other. They placed the 10 8-ton concrete blocks on the higher one to force it down so they could join the girders. But the weight of the blocks caused the span being worked on to buckle, so orders were given to remove them. When they were, the span collapsed downwards, and it caused the entire bridge portion to collapse. It is the deadliest industrial disaster in Australian history. So real quick, let's explain this one a bit deeper. So here we have we're going to do our bridge here in blue. So we've got one half right here. And a camber is basically, if you have a bridge, you can't build a bridge flat like this, because when you have your connections, once you place a load on it, your bridge will bend downwards like this, right? Because you've placed that load on it, it'll collapse downward like that. So if we do this right here, we'll do blue for one side and purple for another. We'll do purple for another. So if you build your bridge perfectly flat like this, when you place a load in the middle of the bridge, like so, it's going to deflect. Because of the weight placed on it, it's going to deflect them both downward, and it's going to make it sag in the middle, like such. So you're going to have that sag with that weight on it. So what they do is they add what's called a camber. Essentially, they kind of curve it up like this so that when weight is placed on it, like so, instead of bending it downwards, it just makes it flat. So you've got your weight placed on it, and it goes flat like this instead of bending it all the way downward. Now, on the day of the disaster, they were putting together the bridge, and they had one going this direction that was cambered like this, and then they had one going the other direction. But when they placed it, they realized this one was curved slightly higher than the other one. Oh, I'm off my little whiteboard here on my drawing here. So you got curve up like this. It's way more dramatic than it needs to be, but just to give you an idea. And then they had the other one like this. They can't connect these now, right? Because this one's sitting up higher. So what they did was they got 8 10-ton concrete blocks and put them right here on the end. Like so. That's only 3. So that it would hopefully push this down enough this direction so that they could connect these two and it wouldn't be a problem. But when they did this, it caused this whole thing to buckle down to here. That's a problem. That makes it structurally deficient. And then when they removed all of these blocks, instead of going back up, it caused this buckle back here to break, and it collapsed straight down to the ground. At the time, they had put a lot of the workers' lunch buildings that they would go and eat lunch in to stay out of the weather and all that. They had built it directly underneath the bridge. So when the bridge came down, it crushed several of these, killing a number of construction workers. Our next disaster is the Estadio Doroteo Flores disaster. On October 16, 1996, a FIFA World Cup qualification game for the 1998 World Cup was scheduled to be played between Guatemala and Costa Rica at Estadio Doroteo Guamash Flores Stadium. On the day of the match, approximately 50,000 people were trying to enter the stadium, but the problem was it only seats about 37,000. Hundreds of people with counterfeit tickets surged into the stadium and broke through the gates in an attempt to make it to the seats. When that happened, a crowd crush began, and security could not find a way to get to the doors on the pitch to open them to allow everyone pinned behind the fence to escape. Eventually, the fence gave way and the crush cleared out. In total, 84 people died in the crowd crush at the stadium, and the actual game itself was delayed that day because, in order to account for all of the injuries and all of the deaths, they had to lay out the deceased individuals on the track around the actual pitch itself, and that essentially prevented them from being able to play the game for very obvious reasons. The game would later be played at a remote location that had no fans in the stands for the game itself. Our final disaster this week is the second deadliest day for firefighters in New York history. Everyone knows the first deadliest day for firefighters in New York history is September 11, 2001. But the second deadliest day for firefighters in New York City was actually October 17th, 1966. Not many people know about this particular fire. It's known as the 23rd Street Fire. So on October 17th, 1966, a fire began around 9:30 p.m. in the American Art Galleries, an art dealer just off 22nd Street in in Manhattan, New York. The building stored a significant quantity of flammable material for painting frames in the basement. So they had lacquers, they had paint, they had all of the wood needed to actually make the frames for the paintings that they sold. When the first arriving engine arrived on scene, they found significant smoke showing from the 22nd Street building. It was a 4-story brownstone. There was an art gallery that made their own frames in the basement in the first floor, and then an art gallery on the second floor. And then the third floor was a lamp manufacturer, and then the fourth floor was a family that lived in the building. The family that lived in the building are the ones that reported the fire in the basement. When they arrived on scene, they made entry into the building, went down to the basement, and found significant flames in the basement. They made some minor progress against the fire in the basement, but they couldn't get all the way back to the other end of the building. At the same time, the battalion chief on scene received a call from an alarm company that there was light smoke showing in the Wonder Drug building on the 23rd Street side of this particular building. So one side was this 4-story brownstone. On the other side was a 5-story, basically commercial building. Now, I'll show you a map of what New York City currently looks like. You can't see the actual area anymore. The building has been replaced, but this is kind of what we're looking at. So if you look right, so looking at this map right here, this is 23rd Street. This is 22nd Street. So they made entry over here on this side of this building. Remember, this is not the original building. And made entry here. As they were making entry here and fighting the fire in the basement, they got a call for light smoke showing. I'm going to use blue. Light smoke showing on this side. It was just light smoke on the first floor of the Wonder Drug on the opposite side of the building. Now, at the time, these two buildings shared a common basement. There was a wall that was supposed to be separating the two, but there was a common basement across the entire block. It was 100 feet long, and it was supposed to be 50-50. Now, real quick, we're going to draw a diagram of what this building looked like prior to. Well, I'll tell you in a minute. So we have, on this side here, we have this building here, like this. This is 23rd Street. It had a basement like that. On the other side was the 22nd Street building, like so. Also had a basement. These had a common basement throughout. There was kind of originally a little gap, but they did, in fact, have a common basement. Kind of like that. This is all underground. This is ground level right here. This over here is the 22nd Street side. So when the fire department originally showed up, they have fire in this basement over here, right? Like this. They come down the stairs. In here, they make entry. They start spraying water onto the fire, like such. As they're standing there, they get call for light smoke conditions over here in this building. They send a group of firefighters around to the other side. They make entry. They go down in the basement because firefighters over here can see that there's a wall back here. They can see flames, but they can see there's a wall back here. They can't quite get to it to see what's going on. They think that maybe the fire has pushed into the other building past this particular wall. They don't know why yet, but they think that may have been what happened. So they come over here for light smoke conditions. Firefighters come in the front door. They go down in the basement. They find light smoke conditions in the basement, but no flames. No flames whatsoever here. Meanwhile, over here, this particular fire, as they're trying to put it out, is getting worse and worse back in this area as it's burning and burning and burning. They have 10 firefighters that are standing on the first floor of this Wonder Drug building over here. They have 10 back here. They have 2 over here. Suddenly, about an hour after the fire was first reported, approximately 30 feet of the back portion of this Wonder Drug base or first floor collapses down into the basement, dropping these 10 firefighters into the basement and killing them in the flames. As soon as that happens, fire erupts out of the basement into the first floor and instantly flashes over and kills these 2 firefighters up here. So what exactly happened? Because the last anyone knew, they only had light smoke conditions both in the basement of Wonder Drug and on the first floor of Wonder Drug. So what led to this floor collapse? Well, it turns out that prior to this fire happening, the owners of the art studio over here, let me erase all of this real quick so we can draw a little bit. The owners of the Wonder Drug over here had done some remodeling. And when they did that remodeling, they added a little addition onto the back of this building like this, which provided some connection. But not only did they do that, this whole area right here is 100 feet. 50 of it was Wonder Drug, 50 of it was the art studio, give or take. Pretty much right down the middle. When they did this remodel, they took out this wall here. Let me draw the rest of this building over here real quick so there's no confusion. When they did the remodel, they took out this wall right here and they moved it 30 feet this direction. So instead of only having wood and lacquer and paint and all of that in this portion over here, it was extended all the way 30 feet underneath Wonder Drug. So this entire basement was full of wood and flammable liquids and all of that. So when the fire got really going and was pushing back towards this wall, back burning all throughout this area, it was actually burning the underside of the floor here. But usually when you're in a fire, you can feel the heat as a firefighter coming through the floor when there's a basement fire. But they never felt any heat whatsoever. And there is a reason for that. You see, the floor itself was made up of, there were 3-inch by 14-inch wood joists, floor joists like such, that ran along. And then on top of that, they put 3/4-inch wood flooring. And then on top of that, they put 5 inches of concrete. And then on top of that, they put down a layer of essentially tile. Which, if you add all of that together, equals, number one, a ton of weight. And number two, you're not going to get much heat through 5 inches of concrete, 3/4 inch of wood, and then tile itself. Much of that heat is going to remain in the basement. But the problem with that is that the temperatures in this area, since there's no ventilation or anything like that, it's just going to sit here and cook and cook and cook and cook. So eventually, these 3-inch by 14-inch floor joists are eventually going to be consumed enough that they will collapse under the weight of this massive amount of floor above them, which is what happened and dropped these firefighters down into the fire. And as soon as this floor right here was gone, it had access to a ton of oxygen because this door was open here. They have windows on the front. As soon as this floor would have opened, this fire gets met with an onrush of oxygen and just rockets out this direction. Probably almost immediately. Would have almost immediately reached flashover conditions, which is about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the first floor of this drugstore, which meant these firefighters had no chance. The 10 firefighters standing on the floor that fell through had no chance whatsoever. The reason they sent firefighters down here into the basement was because they thought they had fire extension. They were trying to figure out where the wall was to figure out how much material they had to deal with, but you couldn't tell from the inside that the wall had been moved because it had been moved closer to them. They couldn't see past the flames and smoke and all that to see that this wall had been moved. So there was no way that these firefighters could have ever known that this was going to be a problem. Now, had the owners of the building done actual fire permits and building permits, which they didn't do, it might have been a chance. Had they noticed that this building right here had been an add-on, they might have noticed something as well, because when there's an add-on, you become more wary of additional add-ons or additional changes that may have happened, but they simply didn't, and it cost 12 firefighters their lives in New York City. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoy it. As always, you like, subscribe, comment, do whatever. Stay safe, and remember to check your smoke detector batteries.